Genossen und Genossinnen, am 30. Januar sind in Deutschland die Würfel gefallen. Und ich glaube nicht, dass die Gegner, die damals noch gelacht haben, heute auch noch lachen. Wir sind friedliche Bürger dafür, dass niemals wiederkommt das Zeitalter dieser korrupten Parteierscheinungen.
Niemals dagewesenen Millionen Demonstrationen hat sich am heutigen Tage die ganze deutsche Nation,
also in those who carried out the worst crimes supported by the beliefs of the regime.
Ich habe diese jüdische Angelegenheit aus Idealismus so lange gemacht, solange es sich aufbauende Werte handelt.
And those who had no problem getting their hands dirty to turn the Holocaust into a terrifying reality.
Von euch werden die meisten wissen, was es heißt, wenn 100 Leichen beisammen liegen. Wenn 500 da liegen oder wenn 1000 da liegen.
These voices bear witness to the damage caused by the Third Reich and continue to generate an echo that runs through the history of a world that will never forget the brutal war.
Aber das Volk kann ihnen ja nicht nachfolgen. Das Volk ist ja gekettet an seinen Boden, ist ja gekettet an seine Heimat, ist ja gebunden an die Lebensmöglichkeiten seines Staates, der Nation.
When Adolf Hitler began his political career in 1920, he was very clear about his goals, and he knew that to achieve them, he would need the support of the masses. That is why throughout his career he perfected his oratory and communication techniques using a wide variety of experiences and resources. He had to be able to transmit his message clearly, but also reach people at such a deep level that he could manipulate them. That is how he worked, by analyzing speeches by political leaders throughout history, or in advertising and psychology theories to combine different methods. Any tool was useful to achieve a perfect technique. Over time, the Führer built a successful model following some basic but very calculated guidelines to influence his audience.
Ich bin aus euch selbst herausgewachsen, bin einst selbst unter euch gestanden, bin in 4,5 Jahren Krieg wieder mitten unter euch gewesen und habe mich dann durch Fleiß, durch Lernen und ich kann sagen durch Hungern langsam emporgearbeitet. In meinem innersten Wesen bin ich immer das geblieben, was ich vorher war. Der Völkerstreit oder Hass untereinander, er wird gepflegt von ganz bestimmten Interessenten.
The Nazi leader was skilled at simplifying complex problems and offering seemingly simple and straightforward solutions. He portrayed Jews, communists, and other groups as the culprits of Germany's problems, which made his messages easier to understand and mobilize the masses. On the other hand, his speech called for national unity and the exclusion of enemies of the state. This included both the exaltation of German nationalism and the demonization of those who were considered threats. And to all this, he often added metaphors that helped make his views more accessible and convincing. This also contributed to creating a clear image of what he considered the mission and goals of his regime. However, as we mentioned at the beginning, we do not want to stop at words alone, and that is why we seek to understand what Hitler was conveying with his non-verbal language. The Führer used very pronounced facial and body expression during his speeches. His sweeping gestures, dramatic movements, and intense facial expressions were all part of his style for capturing and holding an audience's attention. He often adopted striking postures and walked in a way that projected authority and determination. His physical presence was carefully crafted to command respect and control the stage. Eye contact was also instrumental in connecting with his audience, creating a sense of closeness and helping to command the audience's attention. Finally, his way of speaking included changes in pace and intonation to emphasize certain points and maintain his listeners' interest. He alternated between a calm tone and a more passionate one to influence listeners' emotions. Every time he spoke, everything was millimetrically calculated.
Der nationalen Regierung auf den Gebieten des wirtschaftlichen Lebens. Hier wird ein Gesetz alles Handeln bestimmen. Das Volk lebt nicht für die Wirtschaft und die Wirtschaft existiert nicht für das Kapital, sondern das Kapital dient der Wirtschaft und die Wirtschaft dem Volk.
Hitler was undoubtedly a master at combining the elements necessary to manipulate the masses and consolidate his power, taking advantage of both rhetoric and nonverbal communication for his political ends. However, he knew that to achieve his plans, he could not do it alone. Your first companion in this video will be one of his closest people, the Minister of Propaganda of the Third Reich, Joseph Goebbels. We are talking about one of the most important minds of Nazism to influence public opinion and consolidate the regime. His skill in different types of communication was fundamental to the success of German propaganda, and his secret was the clarity and simplicity that always accompanied him. Goebbels was direct, and his messages reached any audience in a simple way, which contributed to his goal of mobilizing large masses, both when he was on stage or in the most intimate spaces of power.
Das freut einen, dass so viele mit dem goldenen Parteiabzeichen dabei sind. Und Sie Landarbeiter, ja. Wie viele Kinder haben Sie? 12. Da muss ich mich ja genieren. Wie viele Kinder haben Sie? 3. Also hier, das ist das Beispiel. Da hinten sitzt einer, der hat 32. Ja, aber nicht mehr einer. Was? Wie viele haben Sie? 3, das ist ja gar nichts.
Beyond this closeness that he could generate with citizens who supported the ideas of Nazism, Goebbels could also be incisive when making emotionally charged speeches appealing to nationalism, hatred, and fear to generate greater support for the cause. There he applied another of his secrets, which was the theory of repetition. He believed that certain messages were recorded in the public's mind efficiently if they were heard many times, and that was how the regime's propaganda worked in the media. The Nazi also used to demonize the enemies of the Third Reich, such as Jews, communists, and other groups, creating scapegoats. He alternated between an optimistic tone and one of victimization, pointing to Germany as the one harmed by international conspiracies, while promoting a hopeful vision of the future under the regime.
What does the new Germany think of economic developments in the States?
Wir betrachten die wirtschaftliche Entwicklung in Amerikas mit dem allergrößten positiven Interesse. Und wir sind dort der festen Überzeugung, dass Präsident Roosevelt und seine Berater auf dem richtigen Wege sind. Es handelt sich in der Tat um das größte wirtschaftliche und soziale Problem aller Zeiten.
In terms of nonverbal language, Goebbels was known for his ability to use facial expression and posture to underline his messages. Everything was carefully orchestrated to project authority, urgency, and emotion. He used dramatic gestures and sweeping movements to emphasize key points and hold the audience's attention. He aimed to communicate enthusiasm and conviction. Joseph Goebbels, along with the Führer, was one of the most influential men in Nazism. He accompanied Hitler to the end. On May 1st, 1945, the day after the Nazi leaders died, the Minister of Propaganda took the same path with his entire family. It is time to continue with our list and meet other great figures of the regime. In this case, we will talk about one of the main Nazi leaders, the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. He was recognized for being the high-ranking official in charge of conceiving and supervising the implementation of the so-called final solution, the plan to murder the Jews of Europe. His communication style was distinctive and reflected his important role. He was known for his technical and methodical speeches. His presentations often had an analytical and bureaucratic tone, focusing on organizational and administrative details, rather than being emotionally charged like Hitler's. He used deeply ideological language that reflected his worldview based on racial purity and Aryan superiority. He often spoke about the importance of discipline, morale, and loyalty within the SS.
Genauso wenig wie wir am 30. Juni gezögert haben, die befohlene Pflicht zu tun und Kameraden, die sich verfehlt hatten, an die Wand zu stellen und zu erschießen. Und wir darüber niemals gesprochen haben und sprechen werden.
This speech by Himmler was delivered at a private meeting he held with SS officers in October 1943, where he called on them to keep secrets about his acts of brutality, despite endorsing them as part of their job. The ruthless leader of the force had a more formal and less charismatic presence compared to other Nazi figures such as Hitler or Goebbels. His posture was rigid, and his non-verbal communication style reflected his methodical and bureaucratic approach. The SS chief tended to maintain a physical and emotional distance in his interactions. Although he was not dismissive, his communication style did not attempt to create a strong personal connection with the public, but rather to convey authority and professionalism. And in that same way, he sought to justify and reinforce the policies and actions of the regime, especially in relation to the persecution of groups considered undesirable.
Meine Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Es gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk wird ausgerottet. Fast in jeder Partei genossen. Das da steht in unserem Programm drin. Ausschaltung der Juden, Ausrottung, machen wir Kleinigkeit.
Himmler's last characteristic was his use of uniforms and symbols that underlined his authority and the military nature of his role. His appearance was carefully controlled to project power, seriousness, and discipline. But all this ended on May 20th, 1945, when he was captured by Russian soldiers and handed over to the British. 3 days later, while undergoing a body cavity search, he committed suicide by biting a cyanide capsule that he had hidden in his mouth for that very purpose. Now we move on, and we come to meet one of the main people responsible for the logistics of the Holocaust, Adolf Eichmann. This character in charge of carrying out the plans of Nazism openly displayed his cold and technical character that contrasted with the emotional intensity of other leaders of the regime. His statements focused on administrative details, reflecting his role in the organization and execution of the extermination policies. He avoided emotional or ideological language in favor of a more neutral and factual approach. This was his response at his trial in December 1961 in Israel, when he was asked about his duties, which included rounding up and deporting Jews, as well as confiscating their property.
האם זה לא מתאים לתפקידיך, ארבעת התפקידים האלה?
Jawohl, das stimmt. Der Chef der Sicherheitspolizei gab seine Weisung über den Amtschef, falls dies notwendig war und der Amtschef nicht selbst die Weisung erteilte. Und der Amtschef 4 erteilte mir die Weisung, so und nicht anders zu handeln.
היית לגמרי פסיבי במילים אחרות.
Passiv kann man nicht gut sagen. Ich habe das, was ich eben schilderte, getan und dann habe ich gehorcht und die Arbeiten durchgeführt, die befohlen wurden.
Eichmann evaded his actions and justified himself by saying that he was simply following orders. In this way, he minimized his responsibility for the crimes. He tried to present what he had done as something inevitable or part of a professional duty, distancing himself emotionally from the consequences of his actions. This was also achieved by his formal and carefully structured communication that avoided any kind of speculation or ambiguity. All this in turn was reinforced non-verbally through a generally upright and formal posture. His facial expressions were empty, which contributed to an impression of coldness and emotional distance. Eichmann maintained an attitude of obedience and submission during the trial, assuring that he only followed orders and did not care about what was happening with the transports of Jews that were constantly being sent to the concentration camps.
Ich wusste das nicht, denn die Transportbegleitung war nicht meine Zuständigkeit gewesen, sondern lag im Zuständigkeitsbereich der Ordnungspolizei. Aber ich habe das gehört und gelesen. Wenn ich die Macht und die Möglichkeit gehabt hätte, es zu verhindern, dann hätte ich gar nicht erst angefangen damit, sondern ich hätte in meinen Gedanken und meinem Wollen weitergearbeitet.
During the trial, he followed protocol. His behavior was carefully calculated to present an image of a diligent and loyal official, avoiding showing any signs of remorse or guilt. But despite this, he was sentenced to death by hanging for crimes against humanity, a sentence that was carried out in the early hours of June 1st, 1962, in the Israeli prison of Ramla. Next on our list is Hermann Goring, one of the main leaders of the Nazi regime and second in command of the Third Reich. He had a distinctive communication style, and both his speech and behavior reflected his military and political role, as well as his flamboyant personality. This figure was characterized by being bombastic and pompous. He used language full of exuberance and self-congratulation. In his speeches, he frequently extolled the achievements of the regime and his own importance within it. In this case, we can hear him being questioned during the Nuremberg trials, where he referred to his influence and that of his colleague Wilhelm Frick, the then Minister of the Interior of the Third Reich.
Dass dieses durch die Gerichte nicht überprüft werden konnte, wollte ich noch ausführen, dass eine Verfügung erlassen worden war, durch mich und Frick gemeinsam, dass Männer, die in das Konzentrationslager eingeliefert, also Persönlichkeiten eingeliefert wurden, dass ihnen nach 24 Stunden der Grund ihrer Einlieferung bekannt gegeben werden sollte und sie nach 48 Stunden, oder es war jedenfalls eine enge Beschränkung, einen Anwalt, das Recht auf einen Anwalt hatten.
Goering used metaphors and analogies to illustrate his points, which helped to capture the audience's attention. He was persuasive in justifying the actions of Nazism and promoting loyalty to the Third Reich. His speeches were often designed to inspire trust and admiration, as well as reinforce ideology. In his speeches, he often combined elements of his role in the military and in politics. He often spoke about victory and military power, as well as his role in the administration and economy of the regime. On the other hand, his body posture was perceived as imposing and authoritarian, especially due to a remarkable physical presence. Goering also tended to have a wide range of facial expressions, from magnanimous smiles to intense looks that hid the enormous brutality he carried on his shoulders. This Nazi was one of the main promoters of the concentration camps, in which around 6 million people died during the Holocaust. The end of Hermann Goring came with the death sentence, although not as expected. He was due to be hanged on the 16th of October 1946, but the night before he committed suicide by biting a cyanide ampule that he had hidden in his mouth, just like Himmler. Now it's time to meet our next character. In this case, we'll hear from one of the first members of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler's main secretary. We're talking about Rudolph Hess, whose way of communicating was greatly influenced by his closeness to the Führer and his role in the administration of the regime.
Sie waren uns der Garant des Sieges. Sie sind uns der Garant des Friedens. Adolf Hitler! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
Hess tended to use formal and respectful language, in line with his role as secretary and close liaison to Hitler. His statements were meticulous and considered, reflecting an administrative role rather than that of a prominent public speaker. Although he was not known for lengthy speeches, when he did speak, he was direct. His interventions focused on supporting the regime's policies, without going into great ideological or emotional detail. He often emphasized his loyalty to the Führer and his commitment to the Nazi cause. He was also careful with his language to avoid any kind of controversy or mistake. Because of his role as secretary, Hess had to maintain a balance between expressing support for policies and avoiding statements that could be misinterpreted.
Wir Soldaten auf allen Seiten fühlen uns frei von jeder Verantwortung für den letzten Krieg. Wir wollen gemeinsam kämpfen, eine neue Katastrophe zu verhindern. Denn das muss die Welt wissen. Wenn uns Frontkämpfern die Erinnerung an die Schrecken des Krieges noch tausendfach vor Augen steht, wenn die junge Nachkriegsgeneration den Krieg so wenig wie wir Alten will.
Although his language was not as radical as that of other Nazi leaders, Hess used key terms and concepts from Nazi ideology to ensure that his message was aligned with the official discourse of the party. Meanwhile, particularities in his nonverbal behavior could be seen through an upright and formal posture. Hess's presence was not as imposing or charismatic as that of Hitler or Goebbels, but he conveyed a sense of seriousness and dedication. His gestures were generally restrained and controlled. Unlike some of the other Nazi leaders who used sweeping movements to emphasize their points, he tended to employ more reserved and measured body language. He often maintained serious and focused facial expressions, appropriate to his role and position in the party hierarchy. In his interactions, he was also respectful toward higher-ranking figures, and his behavior reflected his role as a subordinate and his support function to the leadership of the Third Reich. Like so many other Nazis, Hess was part of the Nuremberg trials, where he was sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against peace and humanity. He spent more than 40 years locked up in Spandau prison in Berlin until he hanged himself on August 17, 1987, at the age of 93. It is time to move on, and we come to Albert Speer, the Nazi Minister of Armaments and War Production. A pragmatic and professional man, he often used technical and analytical language, especially when speaking on issues related to battle and planning. His style reflected his training as an architect and his perspective on efficiency and administration. His speeches were generally clear and precise. He avoided the grandiloquence and ideological language that characterized other Nazi leaders, preferring more direct and fact-based communication. In his speeches, Speer often focused on results and solving practical problems. His presentations were aimed at showcasing his achievements, but everything changed when he had to face his trial in Nuremberg in 1946, where he was accused of crimes against humanity.
Was bedeutet mein eigenes Schicksal nach allem, was geschehen und bei einem solch hohen Ziel? Das deutsche Volk hat in früheren Jahrhunderten viel zu dem Aufbau menschlicher Kultur beigetragen. Es hat diese Beiträge oft in Zeiten geliefert, in denen es genauso ohnmächtig und hilflos war wie heute. Wertvolle Menschen lassen sich nicht zur Verzweiflung treiben.
Although he was a senior member of the regime, Speer did not tend to use radical or inflammatory language. His rhetoric was more moderate and less emotionally charged compared to other Nazi leaders. His posture was formal and serious, appropriate to reflect his role as administrator and architect of the war. His manner of presentation maintained a professional focus to his words and an attitude of respect toward his audience. His facial expressions were usually focused. His appearance and behavior were carefully controlled. He was usually impeccably dressed, and his conduct was meticulous, reflecting detail and organization. During the Nuremberg trial, Speer showed a tendency to reflect on his actions and take some responsibility, although his communication in that context was more strategic and defensive.
I am responsible for all those things, for all the slave labor. I didn't avoid telling clearly to the judges what I did, and even I felt responsible when it were orders of Hitler. Others accused, they always were claiming that it were orders of Hitler. I didn't do that.
Although he accepted this degree of responsibility, he never assumed himself guilty of the heinous crimes committed, but rather felt part of a chain. It can be said that his tactic was more effective than that of other Nazi leaders. Since his sentence was lenient, he had to serve 20 years in prison and was released in 1966. As we approach the end, we have to meet our last character in this video, and for that, we must introduce you to one of Hitler's main diplomats. We are talking about Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Third Reich. This figure and his way of communicating were key to managing the international relations of the Nazi regime. Von Ribbentrop used grandiloquent and formal language in his speeches and statements. He often used a tone that underlined the importance of the policies of the Führer's government and his own role as an official. This style reflected his intention to project authority and prestige. His words were full of diplomatic terms, with a focus on relations with other countries. However, he emphasized Germany's position on the world stage and the importance of its agreements and alliances.
Germany and Japan, who are not prepared to tolerate these activities any further, have now taken action. The agreement between Germany and Japan against the Communist International, signed today, constitutes a turning point in the defensive struggle of all orderly and civilized nations.
In his speeches, von Ribbentrop frequently incorporated elements of nationalist and propagandistic rhetoric, tailoring his message to Nazi ideology and highlighting Germany's role as a global power. He also attempted to persuade other leaders and countries to align themselves with the policies of the Third Reich. His language was designed to convince and, at times, pressure his interlocutors to accept German demands. Non-verbally, he maintained an upright and authoritative posture, reflecting his role as a senior official in the Nazi regime. His physical presence was designed to command respect. In addition, his gestures were often broad and theatrical, especially in public contexts. This helped to emphasize his message and project an image of power and control. This is how the Third Reich's foreign minister looked during his trial in Nuremberg in August 1946.
Wir beabsichtigten, war, unsere elementarsten Daseinsbedingungen wahrzunehmen, genauso wie England seine Interessen wahrgenommen hat, sich ein Fünftel der Welt untertan zu machen, wie die USA einen ganzen Kontinent und Russland die größte Binnenländermasse der Erde unter ihre Hegemonie brachten.
The official's facial expressions were generally serious and determined. In diplomatic situations, he tried to show confidence and determination, using them to underline the importance of policies and negotiations. On the other hand, in his interactions with other international leaders, von Ribbentrop tried to maintain an attitude of superiority and respect. His behavior was designed to show that Germany had a dominant position and that he himself was a skilled and powerful negotiator. Another great reflection of what the regime wanted to show the entire world. His end came after the trials, where he was sentenced to death and became the first Nazi leader to be executed by hanging in the early hours of October 16, 1946. In this way, we have been able to take a tour of some of the main figures of the Third Reich, listening to their voices and observing them as they made their message known. They all had their small and particular characteristics, although they were also united by many others, mainly those that were dominated by ideology. Each of them was part of the enormous machinery of death that was Nazism, and they had enormous responsibility for the atrocities that were committed during World War II. Now, after having learned more about the personalities of the cruel and fearsome German leaders who accompanied Adolf Hitler, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end. We look forward to seeing you again in our next military history video.